Okay, so this is the first talk of a new series in the Middle Way Network Zoom meetings. And this series is on the 5 principles and the threefold practice. This talk is a kind of general introductory talk about the Middle Way in general, kind of setting the scene for talking about the 5 principles, which we'll be going through the aspects of the Middle Way bit by bit. So the title of this talk is, what do we mean when we call the Middle Way universal? Because I think, well, this is a central question, really, that it might be helpful for everyone to be clear about from the beginning. I mean, he's setting the scene really, well, what is the Middle Way in the way that I'm going to be presenting it. What is it that's the focus of the Middle Way society? And what has that got to do with the Buddhist Middle Way, which obviously owes quite a lot to. So I'm aiming to answer questions about that. And in the process, I'll also be talking a bit about absolutization, which is setting the scene really for what the Middle Way is about. So yeah, the aim of this series of talks as a whole is to offer a practical account of what the Middle Way distinctively involves. And this account of the Middle Way is, which for lack of a better term I call the universal Middle Way, it's an attempt to pan out, if you like, to the universal level of what the Middle Way means for anybody when they're trying to practice it in any set of circumstances, rather than in the terms of a specific tradition that might have explicitly or implicitly talked about the Middle Way. And now there are only 2 which, so far as I've discovered so far, talk explicitly about the Middle Way. And those are Buddhism and, to some extent, apparently independently, Carl Jung and the Jungians. But there are lots of other traditions, including Christianity, where you might argue that there is some implicit sign of the Middle Way in some places. Perhaps you could build the Middle Way. And you can also argue about all sorts of other elements of all sorts of other traditions, like scientific method, for example. So my perspective is that these specific Middle Ways are applications of the universal Middle Way. So they're applications of a more general principle, which we can try and get hold of, applied in a specific context. Because obviously, where you've got Middle Way being discussed in a specific context, like Buddhism, then there are specific ways of talking, specific concerns, particular aspects of the practical environment and culture which impact how it's approached. So typically, in the Buddhist context, the Middle Way was the middle way between eternalism and nihilism, and that reflected the arguments which took place in the Buddhist context, where people were concerned particularly about karma and rebirth and whether it was true or not, or whether it was justified, a moral or spiritual life or not. I don't think those are universal ways of talking about the Middle Way, because people are not concerned generally about the same things, at least not across the world all the time these days. So that's why I'd say that the Buddha's Middle Way is often very inspiring, but nevertheless an application of the universal Middle Way, or an example of it. But so trying to pan back to the Middle Way in the universal sense, there's obviously a big danger of trying to define the Middle Way in a universal way, at the ending of actually just imposing one's own specific cultural assumptions or whatever assumptions on the way that one presents it and understands it. The way I think we can try and avoid that is through provisionality and the practice of provisionality. So the middle way not only includes provisionality, it's one of the things it's about, but it should itself be a provisional theory. So that means that it's one that can be tested and modified in application, in experience. That's why I constantly talk about the middle way as a method of judgment, not a belief about the cosmos. So if it was a belief about the cosmos or a metaphysical belief, then we'd basically be stuck with it. There's no way we could modify it in light of experience. It would be the truth. But that's not what it's about. I don't think it's about how we, it's a principle of how we respond or try to respond to what comes in, to what we experience at each point. So we can apply it at each point with whatever material, whatever experience we have, whatever prior conditions we have, and we work with those. But if I say it can be tested by application and experience, then obviously you need some sort of criterion for your test. And the basis of the test, I think, is basically a negative one, that is whether it overcomes absolutization. So that's why in writing my series of books on this, I started with absolutization to try and make clear, well, what's the problem that we're trying to solve here. Now, in some ways, that for many people, that's a counterintuitive way of starting because, well, people tend to respond much more strongly to a positive ideal of some kind, or at least some positive position. And as George Lakoff famously pointed out, you know, if you ask people to not think about an elephant, then what they'll immediately do is think about an elephant. So usually it doesn't work just to tell people not to do things. You know. But on the other hand, I do think it's important to clarify in a sort of realistic way how the middle way works, to begin with the negatives. And that's because the negatives are easier to identify than the positives. So if we try and identify what we should be working towards, whether you call it enlightenment or God's will or ideal society or whatever you want to call it, well, those end up very, very vague most of the time, but also very subject to confirmation bias and rather much less helpful and much more open to abuse because they're not specifiable in the same way, or can't be engaged with an experience in the same way that absolutization can be identified with the experience. So that's what I call the error focus, which I'll come back to a bit later. But so basically the basis of the test is whether we've got the middle way or not, whether it overcomes absolutization. And absolutization is universal, I think, because it's a human problem based on shared physiology, but also the way our psychology integrates the stages we go through in order to integrate our psychology and also cultural influence. So although it's basically things like well, the lateralization of our brains that create the basic conditions for absolutization, it's also intensified and interacts with other psychological issues and cultural issues. So absolutization, I think, can be described in a general human way, but as with anything else in this way of talking, it has to be provisional. So yeah, so when I talk about the universal middle way, then another way of understanding that universality is to talk about bottom-up universality rather than top-down universality. So top-down universality would be thinking you know what the ultimate truth is in some sense, and then deducing from that how we ought to live our lives. Bottom-up universality, hopefully, is responding to experience, facing up to all the limitations that our experience gives us, and then building up from there to work out what it is that how we can best respond to that situation, make the best of that situation. So that works much more like scientific theory does, or it's supposed to do. Yes, so I see science, certainly if it's working as it should do, in a bottom-up way. So it's universal, yeah, so it wouldn't be science if it wasn't trying to generalize about how things are in the world or in the universe. You couldn't have a law of physics which only applied in Surrey and nowhere else, for example. But it's got to also be provisional. It's got to be open to the evidence and changed in terms of the evidence. So basically what I'll be doing the rest of this talk is to introduce absolutization, what it means, much more briefly than the book does, obviously, but to give you some idea about it, and the methods required for addressing absolutization. And it's if I think we work out, well, we've got this phenomenon, this absolutization, which is causing all our problems, then what are the basic ways we have to address it in order to be adequate to it? And if we can identify those, then we've got the universal middle way, basically. We've got at least a skeleton of it. So I think if you are more likely to think in terms of more specific traditions about the middle way works, then they need to be judged in practical terms, really. So in terms of whether they work, because the only alternative to that is to adopt some sort of form of authority, whether it's the authority of a tradition or a group or an individual, as to what the positive ideal is. So when I talk about the middle way, it's not a specific person's middle way, obviously. So I find some people talk about my middle way as though I'd invented it or something. But obviously it's not, it's the middle way. It's the one that works and that may be recognized to whatever degree, perhaps through approaches like this one. But wherever that model fails, it can be improved through experience and inquiry. So I only see myself as trying to initiate that process. Yeah, certainly not finishing it. And just to make a comparison about the universality of the middle way, another point to make, I think, is that it should be available to us, or it would be available to us explicitly or implicitly, regardless of what anybody said about it. So it's a bit like Sir Isaac Newton and gravity, say. Before Sir Isaac Newton propounded the theory of gravity, people didn't float around in the air, the gravity still operated. And in the same way, I think the middle way is was still available before the Buddha and indeed afterwards. It's not a result of what any individual may say about it or not say about it. I mean, Newton made a difference, so Newton formulated a largely convincing theory of gravity, but if I understand the physics correctly, it was later improved upon, or aspects of it were improved upon by others. So again, it's not Newton's gravity, it's just gravity. And the same should apply to the middle way. So that's a kind of apology or contextualization maybe for the structure I'm going to use in this series. So the 5 principles of threefold practice. So they're a model that seems to work so far. I've been using, I think, the model of the 5 principles maybe about 5 years or so now. And yeah, I haven't come across any major problems with it so far. So that's why I've increased my confidence in it and then ended up writing a book about it. So it's a structure that seems to work, but maybe we can change it in the future. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about absolutization as the basic problem that we need to address through the middle way. So absolutization is the way we make things worse for ourselves in the long term. It's obviously got some relationship. If you're thinking in terms of the metaphors used by the Buddha used the metaphor of the second arrow. The first arrow is one that gives you suffering, and the second is one that it's almost the one you fire at yourself, which makes it worse. So it's got some relationship with that, but it's a bit more specific than that, perhaps, or it's been adapted from Buddhist sources in various ways. So the way I would define it is the tendency to assume that we have the whole story. I mean, that's a quick definition of absolutization, but one that often seems to serve. The tendency to assume that we have the whole story. I could add also when applied to a particular judgment. Yes, so that's kind of a reminder that absolutization is happening at each point where we get sucked into it, and could change at different points as well, conceivably change. So when we're in absolutization, when we're judging absolutely, then we often feel we don't have a choice, or it's so obvious what is right or what is true that we couldn't possibly choose otherwise, we couldn't possibly decide otherwise. But absolutization isn't a particular belief or kind of belief. It's much more a way of holding beliefs. So it depends on our psychological state, and that means this is a difficult thing for philosophers, that you can't just define it philosophically. You've got to bring in some psychology as well. You've got to think about the mental states we're in, as well as what we believe and what we say. So it's a way of holding beliefs where we're only aware of a dominant belief and its negation. So you've only got 2 choices. There's the truth, or the right way of doing things as you see them at that point. Perhaps what everyone else is telling you is the right option. And of course, there is the possibility, you are vaguely aware of the possibility of the opposite, the negation of it. So there are 2 options, but you wouldn't really seriously consider that second option because it's unthinkable. It's catastrophic. Yeah. So if you imagine, I don't know, Puritans of the 16th century, or any kind of really rigid group, and so they're locked in a particular set of beliefs shared by everyone around them. So would a Puritan of the 16th century suddenly decide they didn't believe in God? Well, maybe they could be aware very vaguely of that possibility, just because it was so impossible, so in a very abstract way, there is that second option. But there's no third option. The third option just doesn't arise. And that's what absolutization consists in, I think. So we've got the positive belief that overwhelms us, negation, which is unthinkable, but which we've got some sort of abstract idea of. There's no third option, there's no fourth option, there's no other options. They're not available to us, those other options. And if we were asked about them, we might just deny their existence, and people often do. You say, well, it's obvious, isn't it? You know, you can't have a third option there. So the various words for that, there's false dichotomy, there's restricting of the options, there's dualism. You know, there are various philosophical and critical thinking ways of thinking about that kind of restriction. It's a restriction, I think, in mental states, basically. We're not aware of alternative options. So I've said it's not a particular belief, but on the other hand, there are some kinds of beliefs which make it very difficult to hold them any other way than absolutely. So there's some kind of beliefs that it's very difficult to hold other than absolutely because of the form that they take. So there is this crossover, obviously, of certain kinds of beliefs are almost always associated with absolutization as a mental state. And that's what I see maybe as the sort of crucial insight of the Middle Way. There's a crossover between the philosophy and the psychology about what the belief is and how we hold it. And again, if you were to think in terms of the metaphors of the Buddha, then the man with the arrow sums that one up very nicely for me. Yeah, so it's the man with an arrow fired into him, but instead of pulling out the arrow, he goes into endless inquiries about where the arrows come from and what sort of person shot it and so on. So if you're in that kind of mental state where you're not addressing the practical situation, you are only in a sort of cycle, an abstracted cycle of beliefs, then that's very much associated with absolutization and also with metaphysical beliefs. So metaphysical beliefs are ones that are concerned with reality, or think they've got reality in some sense, or it could be non-reality, it could be the opposite of reality, falsehood. So some kinds of beliefs, metaphysical beliefs, tend to be very self-sufficient, and they block examination of themselves from experience, and also some mechanisms that they use to try and maintain themselves independently and keep us thinking that we've got a whole story. And I'll talk a lot more about this when we get onto agnosticism as the fourth principle. You know, those mechanisms whereby metaphysics propagates and maintains itself, how we need to be aware of them. You know, I'm not going to go into that now, but it's an aspect of absolutization. But more immediately, absolutization leads us into reinforcing feedback loops, where we tend to constantly repeat the same beliefs and probably the same behavior following those beliefs, regardless of changing conditions, so we fail to adapt. Now maybe I can show you a diagram here. So here is diagram of a reinforcing and balancing feedback loop. So these are found in systems theory. It's basically, I've started to use, a long time ago, I used to talk about positive and negative feedback loops, but reinforcing and balancing seems a lot clearer to me once I came across that language. So a reinforcing feedback loop is where we've got a belief, potential acting in accordance with that belief, and that forms our whole view of the world. And we just select the information from our experience that gets that belief and all the rest. So we carry on acting as though that belief was true, not changing our understanding of our behavior at all. So that can mean that we get more and more dogmatic, more and more isolated from the conditions around us. A balancing feedback loop, on the other hand, well, it's not totally different, because it's a feature of life, basically, that we carry on in the same cycles to some extent, because of our basic structural setup. But we do also have the capacity to modify our beliefs. So we go around the same cycle, we have beliefs, we act in accordance with them, let's change our view of the world, but new information does come in, and we modify our beliefs slightly, and then we go on the cycle again. So the absolutization tends to create reinforcing feedback loops. The other middle way is the alternative, is obviously that it creates balancing feedback loops. And that's something you can find in any integrative practice, I think. So if you want to ask if something is or is not a helpful and integrative practice, ask yourself, is there a balancing feedback loop I can identify here? Does it help me to adjust in some way? Does it bring in new information or new awareness of some kind? Anyway, so the maladaptiveness of absolutization is that we're stuck in that way. And as we experience this internally in our minds, these are what are known in Buddhism as proliferation or propunction. So we can be aware of this, particularly if we try to meditate and we're just going round and round in circles. So the same anxieties, for example, continually hindering us. We try and do the meditation, we get more anxiety, and that just takes us off the loop. So our overriding motives of obsessive desire or fear are looped with fixed beliefs. And you can see this also in brain terms, that there's a loop between our reptilian brain, so the back or bottom of our brain, where our basic emotions of obsessive desire or anxiety to be associated with, and the linguistic left prefrontal cortex, which is where our representations, our linguistic formulations of what we think is true are created. So we maintain the same beliefs in accordance with the same motives. The motives and the beliefs can form this kind of fixed loop. When we're in this kind of loop, we tend to assume that we've got a whole story, that our so-called cognitive system, our system of representations, is independently right or true, blocking out new information. This is also related in terms of William McGilchrist's work and the brain lateralization with left hemisphere function, with a strong tendency of the left hemisphere, when it's over dominant, to think it's got the whole story. But obviously, when we're in that state, when we're going round and round in circles, there are some circumstances where the countervailing conditions just get overwhelming eventually. So people might live in a world of their own for a while, but eventually the pressures get so much that they have to change. But if you're in this very sort of fixed mode, this absolutizing mode, then probably the form that the change will take, first of all, is what I call flip. So remember the idea I started with here, that we have two possibilities that we're aware of when we're absolutizing. The positive one and the negative one that we're sort of vaguely or abstractly aware of, the negation of it. So that's the only possibility we're aware of at the time. If we're so used to this absolute set of assumptions. So when we finally face up to the possibility this absolute set of assumptions isn't the whole story, then the only alternative we're aware of is the negation. So we go all the way right to the opposite end of the spectrum. We don't even appreciate that it is a spectrum. For flips, you can probably observe this quite often. For example, people who give up smoking one day and then they're back smoking the next day, and then they give up smoking and then the following day. Or think of dramatic religious conversions. So this seems to happen, seems to have happened to St. Paul, we believe the Book of Acts. So this is Caravaggio's depiction of St. Paul having fallen off his horse at the crucial moment of conversion, when he has a crisis. Actually, he's on the road to Damascus, famously, where he's intending to persecute Christians, but there's all this evidence building up that it might be more complicated than that. And so he suddenly has a kind of fit. He falls off his horse, he goes blind, and he completely changes his, goes temporarily blind anyway, completely changes his view to the opposite. He becomes a Christian, having persecuted Christians previously. So flips like that are very common. Form that absolutization takes, because there's no possibility of slight gradual adjustment. So as we'll see when we look at the 5 principles, the third one, incrementality, is about how we can make gradual adjustments, have a gradual understanding instead of flipping. So absolutization also depends on a highly disembodied understanding of meaning. So we have an idea, because we think we know the truth, because we've got this set of propositions, this language that we think represents reality, we also assume that language can represent reality. You've got to assume that in order to assume that your language represents reality. And this goes against all the evidence that we've had collected together since the 1980s in embodied meaning theory. That is, that meaning is based on embodied associations, which are built up through schemas and metaphors. So again, I'm not going to go into that now, but there is an alternative way of thinking about meaning, basically. So if we take that approach, then meaning comes first. Our language is meaningful to us first, and then can be assembled into beliefs for practical purposes. So one of the things you have to kind of defend if you're absolutizing is this assumption that language reflects reality, and particularly that your language reflects reality. That's how things really are. And when we're doing that, it tends to create conflict, because each side who thinks in this absolutizing way thinks it has a representation of the whole story, and neither side will listen to the other sufficiently to adjust their understanding. Again, part of, I suppose, the recognition of this is the possibility of there being another framework of understanding, so we can get beyond the absolute assumptions that are made, for example, about free will, or about God, or about reality, or any of a whole load of other things. So conflicts tends to come from people assuming that their set of beliefs gives a complete explanation of things and there's no alternative to it. And then when other people have an alternative, then that's the unthinkable negation which they're simply opposed to. So absolutization and conflict go hand in hand. And again, so that links particular beliefs with psychological states. And that conflict can be internal, can be within us, and it can also be socio-political. It can be between us and other people, or between different groups. You can also see absolutization as projection. So I talked a lot about this in the archetypes series, the projection of archetypes. When we project, well, we have something that inspires us, perhaps for embodied meaning. So perhaps a hero, for example, who inspires us because we've got this human connection with this person. But we confuse that with the representation of how things are. So we no longer recognize that it's about us being inspired in relation to whatever it is we've experienced, but instead we think, there's this great hero who can fix everything for us. So projection is another form of absolutization, and indeed you can explain all absolutization as one way of thinking about it in terms of projection. Absolutization is also about shortcuts. So it's quicker and easier to absolutize. You adopt a total belief off the shelf, as it were, then you don't need to perform anything more complex, more difficult. And that's the mechanism, as explained by Daniel Kahneman, for example, for how bias works. It relies on a shortcut mechanism. It's easier to operate in a biased way. It saves energy almost. So it's evolved in certain circumstances to save us energy. It becomes absolutized, particularly when we're taken in by the bias. So we think the bias is the whole story. It's not just that we recognize we're taking the shortcut, it's that we don't realize we're taking the shortcut and we think that's the only way we can do it. It's also possible to absolutize a rejection of bias. It's necessarily wrong. Okay, so shortcuts, absolutizations of shortcuts can also work socially, and that's also why absolutization has such a close relationship with power. So absolutization is the easy way to bind a group. If everybody has the same absolute beliefs, then everybody's together, at least superficially for the moment. Everybody's prepared to say the same things, cheer to the same leader or whatever. So if you want to command an army, for example, then that's certainly quite a quick way to do it. And this has been also, well, it's recognizable, I think, in animals. So this coordination of left hemispheres, studies have shown this in groups of animals, for example, like schools of fish. So if that's how absolutization often works socially, that obviously creates cultural reinforcement of absolutization. So groups carry on passing down the same tendencies, and so we get same tendency not just because of our need to belong to a group, but also because our culture just says that's how it is. So we think it's necessary always to think in these terms, absolute terms, which takes us back to metaphysics. It's defended culturally in all sorts of ways, which have become entrenched, particularly in philosophy, religion, political thought. So circular arguments, for example, appeals for authority, infinite rationalizations, claim that metaphysics is inevitable. So all of these things I will go into in more detail later in the series. Okay, so that's a little bit, that's a whirlwind tour of absolutization anyway. So it has all these different facets to it. I mean, in my book there are 23. I haven't been through all 23 of them, but just to perhaps to quickly review then some of the most important ones that I've just been talking about here. So it's dualistic. It's just one belief and its negation. It's a way of thinking. It involves belief about reality. It involves reinforcing feedback loops, proliferation. It leads us to think that our conscious system is independent. It involves flips or fragility. It's disembodied, creates conflict, involves projection, it involves shortcuts, bias, and those shortcuts are used sociopolitically to bind groups as a means to power, and it creates cultural traditions of metaphysics. Okay, so absolutization is a big deal. It's a lot of interconnected phenomena. So it's a tough call to actually attempt to do anything about absolutization, which is why the middle way is difficult. But there are ways of addressing absolutization. And, well, so most broadly, the practices that help us to create the conditions for avoiding absolutization, whether psychologically or sociopolitically, those are what I would call integrative practices. So integration, which I'll talk about a lot more later in the series, is overcoming conflict. Obviously, to overcome conflict, whether internal or external, you also need to overcome absolutization. But integrative practices help us with that in one way or another. So a whole lot of integrative practices we could do, which might help in various ways. Some obvious and common ones, the ones I tend to stress most, just as quickies, are meditation, the arts, and critical thinking. But there are lots and lots of others, psychotherapy, yoga, whatever. So the 5 principles are trying to describe the approach we need in judgment for avoiding absolutization. So if we judge skeptically, provisionally, incrementally, agnostically, and integratively, then I think, well, we stand a much better chance of avoiding absolutization. It's only ever a chance. So those 5 principles provide one way of understanding the practice of the middle way. But how can we identify where the universal middle way is present? So rather than going into the 5 principles too much now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the 4 criteria, which are basically ways of identifying where the universal middle way is present. That is, where we've got a method which stands a chance of actually reducing absolutization. So there are 4 criteria which you'll find these discussed in the later part, the later part of absolutization, after absolutization itself is discussed. So they define any kind of effective response to absolutization. And these 4 criteria are practicality, universal aspiration, judgment focus, and error focus. Now, I've already talked a bit about error focus. Yes, so that the middle way is focused on an avoidance strategy, like so we we find absolutes and we try to avoid those absolutes. That's not to say that we're not actually motivated by all sorts of positive ideas of what we're doing. It's just that those positive ideas are not enough to completely frame what we're doing and to rely on completely. That's the way of framing it. Yeah, leaving aside our focus for the moment, practicality. Practicality is probably the thing we ought to think about most here. So practicality is about actually making a difference, isn't it? So if we want to actually change things through the practice of the middle way, rather than ending up, what often happens if approaches are not sufficiently practical, is that instead you go round a loop of some kind. Perhaps it's a shared loop, so perhaps a group says, here's the solution, here's the ideal, let's do this. But because of some absolutization in the whole way the whole thing is framed, it ends up, at least in some respects, going round another loop. Maybe it doesn't do so in all respects. Usually what different groups and traditions manage is quite complicated. They succeed in some ways and not others. But quite often, I think, where they don't succeed, it's to do with a lack of practicality. So I've got a diagram I can show you which might help to clarify the idea of practicality. So this is from the it's from the Absolutization book. So again, I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but the three major elements of practicality basically are, as I understand them, are effectiveness, embodiment, and responsibility. So if we want something to actually work, rather than just seeming like a good idea, it needs to be effective. And if we follow the effectiveness through a little bit, we've got three major elements of effectiveness that I've identified. So we need to put enough energy into it. It's got to be intense enough. It needs to be directed appropriately, the energy we use, and it needs to be sustainable. We need to keep going. And there are ways that absolutization can interfere with all of those things. So our intensity may be reduced by conflict. It can interfere with directionality because we get confused about which direction to apply our efforts. So, for example, you might try meditating, but do it in a very willful way, and you just sit there clenching yourself to try and make yourself do it. So that's misdirected. That's even though you're really trying. Or then the sustainability. So can you keep it going? Well, one of the features of absolutization is it keeps bringing you back to a conflict which you've repressed in some sense, so that you can't sustain the effort that you start off with. So when we start off trying to achieve something that we think is integrative, but it doesn't succeed as well as we hope, that might be one of those things might be involved. You could also understand it in terms of embodiment. So to be practical, what we do has got to be adapted to the human body and its limitations, including the limitations of our senses and meaning. So it's got to not assume that we're God, which we do surprisingly often. The God-side view, the disembodied view, is so much enculturated as absolutization. And then there's taking responsibility. So we often have moral ideas about responsibility that we just try to impose. So, for example, maybe our parents told us we should be responsible in certain ways, but we didn't actually feel responsible. So therefore we didn't respond adequately to what they were doing, unless we were forced in some way to conform to that. So actually generating that responsibility for ourselves through increasingly integrated states is central to being practical. Okay, so I think that practicality is by far the most important of these criteria, really, that if something is going to be the middle way, if it's going to adequately respond to absolutization, it's got to be practical. It's got to work. And if what we've got doesn't work, then we'll have to keep adjusting it until it does. Yeah, I'll just briefly talk about the other one. So universal aspiration, basically, it can't be the middle way if it only applies in limited circumstances. So we've got to at least want to try to apply it in all circumstances for everybody. And that's why the middle way is not relativist. So as I understand relativism, it's the belief that something could be the whole story, could be complete or absolute within this limited space, a limited time or space. For some people and not others. Okay, and then the judgment focus is the other one, which I haven't mentioned. But again, I have been mentioning judgment and the idea that the middle way is a method of judgment, not a belief about the cosmos. So that's really what judgment focus is about. Yeah, so judgment is the working ground for change. So if we just waffle about universal truths, instead of focusing on how we could actually change our judgments at particular points, then that's very likely just to lead us back into metaphysics and into circular or self-justifying assumptions. Okay, so those four things, I think, can help us to identify what anyone might claim to be the middle way, whether it is or not, or whether it's something else. And obviously, middle way philosophy, as I've tried to develop it, tries to do all of those things, to be practical, universal aspiration, judgment focus, and an error focus. So it tries to be practical in its long-term focus on what works by integrating over time. Our understanding about what works, obviously personal experience helps with that, but scientific evidence is also crucial because we can learn a tremendous amount from scientific evidence, even though it's not absolute. And just take neuroscientific evidence, for example, it's such a huge amount there. It also obviously tries to aspire to universality, and its judgment focus is reflected in the 5 principles. And in particularly, you think about provisionality and incrementality. Yeah, they're especially concerned with judgment. Yeah, our judgments are provisional. They're only for now. They could be changed in the future. And also that they're incremental, so we think about what we're judging in incremental terms, that they're a matter of degree and not absolute. The error focus particularly comes out in the 5 principles as the practice of agnosticism. So avoiding absolutizations on both sides, not just getting sucked into the conflict by only rejecting one side, by taking sides in an absolute conflict, basically. So obviously there are many other ways of approaching things, whether this is in religion or philosophy or psychology or whatever. There are many other approaches that people find helpful. But many of them only do some of those things, but not all of them. So that's certainly those 4 things I've found a helpful guide to try to pick my way through what is helpful and what isn't. when somebody suggests a particular approach or tradition or a new theory or whatever. So many groups or movements, for example, have a universal aspiration, but they're not practical, maybe not practical at all, really. So Christianity, for example, as a tradition, very often seems very lacking in practicality. So it doesn't get down to what we're doing from moment to moment. It gets too caught up in idealizations. On the other hand, there's some very, very practical approaches, say in psychotherapy. But when you get very practical approaches like that, they don't always focus sufficiently on judgment and error. So they can still get caught up in absolute assumptions. But all this is comparative, so we can still learn a great deal from groups or movements that fulfill some of those criteria, but not all of them. And it's certainly a big call, I think, to fulfill all of them. Okay, so I must stop there, I think. So basically, I've been trying to lay the groundwork here, basically, to think about where the 5 principles come from. Yeah, so just to sum up, they come from the overall practice of the Universal Middle Way. The Universal Middle Way is a response to absolutization. So it's helpful to try and understand absolutization to some extent to start with, but you'll also engage with it really by engaging with the middle way as well. So it's absolutization that gives it its purpose, and then the ways we address it, or the ways it can be addressed, I think can be summed up by the 4 criteria, which show ways that it's necessary to overcome absolutization, or at least to make some progress with it. Okay, so if we've got that background and that overall framing, then if we go into the 5 principles in the remaining sessions of the series, hopefully we can take that background reasonably for granted, unless some specific questions come up about it. We can focus much more then on how we can actually improve our judgment in one way or another using the 5 principles. Okay, so I'll stop there for now. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? George?
Yeah, I think you said, Robert, and thank you very much for the talk. It was really good. You said that some types of belief are always or almost always associated or held in an absolute manner. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit, please?
Okay, yeah. I mean, maybe there's a qualification I should have mentioned there, which is that what people mean in context is always very important. So when people get into absolute arguments about metaphysical beliefs, very often they're just seizing on the words, and particularly if they're on the internet where the words are decontextualized, and not thinking about what the person intended in their context when they said those words. So yeah, there's an embodied context to when people use metaphysical beliefs, but when they're sort of putting them forward seriously, in ways that are clearly intended to be statements that this is the truth, this is the final perspective, this is the whole story, then you have little alternative, I think, to take them seriously and that's what they mean. Yeah, for example, if somebody says they believe in the existence of God, say, yeah, there's a huge difference between a philosopher saying that in a debate about God, say, or a theologian, where you've got to take that literally, as it were, metaphysically. And somebody perhaps in a much more devotional or practical context, maybe a meeting in a church, which is actually much more focused on how people feel and how they live their lives. So what you might mean by the existence of God or her relationship to that has got much more to do with how she's being inspired or how she's coping in her life, and much less to do with metaphysical claims. So in those sorts of circumstances, I wouldn't want to get into unhelpful kind of metaphysical interpretations of what people are saying. But at the same time, there are some contexts where you can't avoid them, but that's obviously what people are saying, it seems, and they're even making it explicit as they do so. Does that help, George, do you think?
So it's to do with the context that makes them much more likely to be absolutized. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So there were some occasions when people are quite explicit that they mean to be absolute. Yeah, for think of like the dogmas of the Catholic Church, for instance. Yeah, they're explicitly absolute. But there are also circumstances where people discuss things in very literal, absolutized ways, like in philosophy quite often. So then you've got to interpret them metaphysically at that level. But then they're often debatable in between situations, you know, just having a conversation with somebody, and maybe they start talking in that way, but you have to sort of try and work out what's important to them and what it would be most helpful for them to work with at the moment, perhaps.
Thank you.
Sure, Dennis, you're muted.
Thank you very much. And I don't have much to ask just because I'm processing this, and I'll spend some time thinking, but it's very, very rich. But one thing that comes out of some alternate study I'm doing in terms of coaching, relating to people's pain, and then relating as far as the motivation of what you want to look at, then relating that to Buddhism, starting with pain and dukkha, suffering, that kind of thing. The middle way view of absolutization, as well as all these logical things that you've said, as I reflect on it in my own life, my absolutization has often been in reaction to existential pain, to that kind of need, and that's why I could easily flip from one to the other. But I need some kind of a very strong system. This is the past me. But do you do much talking about the suffering that motivates these strong answers that people often want, need, feel they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the previous series was about, really, the archetypes series. So what inspires people to maintain their practice in response to the difficulties they're encountering? Maybe I don't know if that's speaking to what you're saying there. But also, could I ask you talk about existential pain? Could you say more about what you mean by that?
Well, I never have had the some of the standard Buddhist needs to explain suffering in the world and to overcome things through rebirth and that sort of thing. But I've had, as I reflect on it, an intense need for guaranteed meaning. And even when it's not guaranteed, I mean, your system is a kind of guaranteed meaning about a lack of guarantees. And but that's been my need to feel some kind of a security, seems very deeply the absurdity of life, absurdity of the answers that people give or that traditions give, and that sort of thing, and feeling great insecurity if there is nothing to rest on. So I'm currently just falling in love with chaos theory that explains a bit or hypothesizes why we don't easily find that pattern of security, but the patterns are there.
Right. Thanks. That makes me a bit clear about what you mean. Yeah. I mean, in terms of security, I feel strongly that security is about embodied states. Yeah. So we feel confident because of the state of our body, not because of some certainty that we've got in our abstracts, representational prefrontal cortexes. And that certainty, the idea that certainty is security, is a kind of shortcut, it is a shortcut, because it obviously having that certainty, that absolutization, doesn't actually deliver security. It's steps that we might practically take to ensure security that deliver security. And those depend on our effectiveness in other ways, not on our certainties. So there's security, but there's also meaning. And again, I could talk a lot about meaning, but that meaning should not be confused with belief. Often it's the first step. So that people very often, if they want their lives to be meaningful, they seize on an absolute belief in order to try and make it meaningful. But if we recognize that meaning is prior to belief, and that meaning comes from our embodied states, then we could have that sufficient sense of meaning to support ourselves. So I'm not just talking about what's traditionally called cognitive meaning, but also emotional meaning. We can, particularly through use of the archetypes, I think, maintain a sense of connection with the meaning that we need to motivate us, without necessarily having any absolute beliefs. The beliefs are the next stage. They're constructed out of beliefs. They're not a necessary prior condition for them.
Yeah, that's helpful, and it certainly rings true to my experience, but not your last comment on the archetypes. I find it more in relational things, and what all religions will affirm about the priority of loving relationships, and you can move broader into justice as well. That is much more meaningful to me than tying into these archetypes, because the basis of that archetype, I'm just realizing, is a human construct, a human psychological construct, and not, who knows if it's, it's secure in terms of real meaning, but it doesn't trigger my embodiment as much as love in a very complex, broad way.
Okay, I mean, I think archetypes were involved in those things you mentioned, but maybe we shouldn't get into that now. It's another discussion really, but for example, justice is a concept, but as is love. But if we're inspired by that concept, then I would say that's an archetypal function, archetypal process. But it all depends on the way that we understand archetypes as meaning.
Yeah, those things are concepts. I agree with you entirely at that, but there also can be relationships and actions that the concepts are kind of, you use the language of the concepts.
Yeah, but the concepts are rather like more complex symbols, visual symbols, for example, can inspire us. We can have a response to them, which reminds us about an overall motive or intention.
Yeah, there is a very long discussion there.
There is, yeah. Anyways, it's there if if you're interested in the videos of the previous sessions, we had a lot of discussion about this kind of material. Okay, well, perhaps we're beginning to run out of time here. But does anyone have any other questions before we start to run out? Okay, so I'll go on to the practice focus then, just to talk about it before we finish. I think what the practice focus certainly turned into during the last series was a series of prompt questions. So I'm going to continue with those. So you could see these as questions you can take away with you, but what they're meant to be is prompts for reflection, which particularly connect to your own practice and your own experience. So hopefully the way, if you need it, for connecting what might be quite an abstract discussion to your own experience. Okay, so I've got 4 questions here which you might want to reflect on. As usual, I'll put my notes afterwards on the Slack area where you can get this, along with my other notes. So the first question, do you have intuitive ideas about the middle way that provide a starting point? So I think a lot of people do have intuitive ideas about the middle way. They have ideas, but perhaps they're related to the 2 schematic elements in the middle way. So the path kind of balancing process. The idea that the point of life is to find a balance, for example, is quite common. So yeah, where do you come from in all that? So what are your intuitive ideas about the middle way? What's most basic to you? Or you might have experience of dissatisfaction with the limitations of both sides of an argument. That might be another sort of way. So yeah, does the middle way fit your intuitions? I suppose that is the first question. What intuitions do you have or have had previously? And if it doesn't fit your intuitions, then what issues are arising? Okay, and then the second question, do you tend to approach the middle way mainly through a particular tradition? If so, what are the specific needs of that tradition that have shaped and perhaps limited how it tries to articulate the middle way? And I think there are advantages to being able to engage with the middle way in more than one tradition, but see, some people overwhelmingly do rely on one tradition. So that's the case. I think it's very important to reflect on what cultural circumstances is that developed in. So for example, if you're practicing Tibetan Buddhism, well, that's come out of Tibet, which has had a big effect on it. How is that constrained? How the middle way is viewed? Okay, third question. How do you most commonly think about absolutization? So I've mentioned a number of different aspects of absolutization today. Some of those might be what you might call proxy concepts, so ways you might have thought about absolutization, but in other terms. So some of those may be bias, dogma, proliferation, conflict, obsession, projection. So which of those have mattered to you, and which have you previously related to most strongly as things to work with? So how do you most commonly think about absolutization? And then finally, the fourth question, what techniques and approaches work best in your experience for reducing absolutization? And again, if you're not sure about that, you might want to start thinking about proxy concepts. So what has worked for you to reduce bias or reduce proliferation of meditation or reduce conflict with other people or whatever else? Okay, so it's kind of reflection on the whole background to what we're going to be going into, what the intuitive ideas you start with, what kind of traditions have influenced you, how do you think about absolutization, and what in your experience works best to address it. Okay, so those might want to be things in follow-up discussions. You might want to talk about those questions, or you might want to talk about other things. Any other final questions or comments before we finish? No? Okay. So we will continue then on the first Tuesday in March with the first session on skepticism. So there will be 2 sessions exploring skepticism, which I should mention at the outset is even-handed and not negative, and is all about recognizing uncertainty. Okay, so we'll be looking in much more detail about what that's about the next session. Hope to see you then. Okay, bye-bye everybody.